Welcome to Seaside Quilting Tutorials. My name is Terry, and today we're going to be working on the Tote mesh bag. So this is the Tote Screenplay 6 design. There are several different options. There's 4 different options in the instructions, and we're going to be working on the first one, A. Now at Seaside Quilting Supplies, we have colored mesh. We have all different kinds of colors. We have this pretty pink. We have a purple, navy, gold, orange, all kinds of colors. And they're fun to work with. So let's go ahead and get started with our project. And if you haven't gotten your Tote kit yet, we do have the kit with the pattern, the fabrics. You can order them by theme, and we'll put a theme together for you. Or you can order just the pattern itself and pick out your own. It's up to you. So the first thing that we're going to do is when we get our mesh, it is rolled so it's easier to ship. So when we go to open it up, it just kind of wants to flop to the inside. So what I do is I turn it over and I just straighten out my bottom edge, fold it over, and I'm going to roll it in the opposite direction that it was already rolled. And then I just kind of roll it in my hands a few times. You could press it on a low setting if you put one of those applique mats on top of it. You can't put an iron directly on it or you'll melt it, and nobody wants mesh melted to their iron. That would not be a fun day. So you could press it, but I find that for the most part this rolling it in the opposite direction works. And once I've done that side, I'm going to fold this side over. And I'm just going to roll it a little bit to get this a little straighter. The ends aren't going to matter a lot because we're going to be cutting those off. So I'm not overly concerned with the ends. I just want to get them straight enough so I can get this the size that I need it. Now, for the most part, I won't be telling you any of the sizes. You'll need to get those out of your pattern because it's not my pattern, so I can't give you all the sizes. That wouldn't be fair to the company. The one thing that I do need to tell you is that our mesh is not as wide as if you went and bought actual pet mesh. You can buy pet mesh wider in any length that you want, but our rules, because we wanted to use colored mesh, is a set size. But I like the colors, and I prefer the colors, so I don't mind that my bag will be a little less wide than if I went and used a black mesh that you would get for pets. But that's how I am. If you prefer that, that's fine. So on our mesh, you'll find one end that is sort of like selvage on fabric. And it's woven tighter together. And we're going to use this because this will be our straightest side for the moment. And I'm going to line it up on one of the lines of my cutting mat. I'm going to move it over just a little bit more. So you'll be able to see what I'm doing. I'm just getting it lined up on a line. And once I have that straight on a line, I'm going to hold it in place, and I'm going to move my ruler down to the end until I come to a line that I can line up the bottom so I can get a straight edge on my bottom. So I'm not looking to take off a lot from the bottom. I'm just looking to get it to a point where when I cut across, I'll have a straight line on the bottom of my mesh. I'm not worried about my sides at the moment. I'm going to get those straight afterward. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get my length straight. And once you have your ruler so that it's set, so you're just using a line on your cutting mat. And this will work on one of the 1 yard mats just as well. I just happen to have a longer cutting mat for my table. Okay, so now I have a straight line on the bottom edge. So I'm going to move this over so it's lined up straight on my first line on my mat. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to hold it in place on this end, and I'm going to move my ruler across until I come to the point that it tells me in my directions that I need to cut it. And I'll tell you, every time you move your ruler on the top, it's going to move on the bottom, so make sure that you hold your ruler in place. And I'm just going to cut that excess off and be done with it. So now we have our two straight edges on one end and the other end, and we have it the size that we need it to be. So once again, I'm going to line this up. And I need to get the side so that I can get it straight. So for me, my piece of mesh is wider on this side over the line and wider over this side of the line. And on the opposite sides, it's a little bit shorter. So I'm just getting the top so that it's lined up on a line, nice and straight. And then I'm getting this leveled out so that when I trim it, I'll be able to get a nice straight line on the side. Now, my mesh is supposed to be 18 inches wide, but it doesn't, because it's cut on a machine, it isn't necessarily 100% straight on either side of my mesh. So I have to get this lined up so that my end down here is a little shorter. I've only got a pinch over my line. But when I get down to the other end, all the way down here, I've got a 1/2 inch over. And that's fine because it does the same thing on the exact other side. As long as it all goes over the line that I need it to be, that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trim just one side. And I'm probably going to be a little bit in the way of the camera when I'm doing it. But you'll see when I go to do the other side a little bit better because I'll be out of the way. I've just got to get one side so it's nice and straight for me so that I can cut this. And my ruler's not going to be long enough, but I can see my line through my mesh. I just have to look real careful. And I can see the line of my cutting mat underneath. And I'm going to line up the top of my ruler straight on a line. And then I'm going to make sure that it's straight going down the side. And that way I can ensure that I'm going to be getting a nice straight cut. And so I'm going to cut up to the point that I can, and then I'm going to move my ruler up to the other end. And like I said, I'm going to be just a little bit in the way for a moment on this side so that I can make my cut. And I'm going to hold my rotary cutter right there next to my ruler. And you have to be careful because the mesh is slippery, so it wants to move. And I'm going to slide my ruler up and get it nice and straight on that line again, so I can finish my cut. And just double check to make sure that nothing is shifted on you before you finish cutting. And I'm going to bring my ruler up until it's straight on a line up there, and so that it's straight on the line that I need to cut. And once I feel confident that it's all straight, I'll finish cutting. Okay. So now I have that side all cut. Now I have a straight line down here on this side. So I'm going to get the top straight on a line, and I'm going to get the side straight on a line. And then I'm going to do the other side. And once again, on this side, I only have a pinch over my line, but down the other end, I've got about approximately a ½ an inch over. And once again, I'm going to hold my mesh nice and straight with one hand. And I'm going to line up my ruler so that it's straight on, oh, I shifted it. If you shift it while you're measuring, just put it back where it needs to be so that it's straight again. And actually, I'm going to take a couple of weights, just a couple of my hand weights. And I'm going to put one on this side, and I'm going to put one down that side. And you could use anything that's a little bit heavy that will hold your mesh in place for you. Because if I don't, it's just going to keep moving on me and frustrate me, and then I'm not going to get this cut properly. It's a little bit harder to see on that side. So I'm just double checking everything. I'm making sure that my ruler is straight up here on a line, and it's going straight here on a line. And I'm going to hold that nice and firm in place. And I'm going to cut across my ruler, and I'm going to stop. And I'm going to hold my rotary cutter in place. And then I'm going to move my ruler over and line it up again. It's like a balancing act. And then I'll finish cutting it. Okay. So now we have our mesh the size that we need it, and it's nice and straight on all of the sides. And we're just going to leave this here for the moment. We'll come back to it. I just wanted to show you how to prepare your mesh and get it ready for the next steps. And we're going to move over to the sewing machine where we can get our other pieces ready. So the one thing that I did do was I cut all of my fabric pieces out and my trim pieces out ahead of time. So when you cut your trim pieces that are going to go on your pocket, you'll just cut them and then you'll fold them in half and press them. And I just do this ahead of time because then I'm all ready to go and I don't have to worry about what needs to be cut and have to be jumping up for everything. I am using batting with mine, so because I'm using 100% cotton. If you're using denim or a canvas, then don't use the batting. You won't need it. It'll make it too heavy, too thick when you're sewing. So I do recommend, even though you're going to have the video as a guide, I always recommend that you read through your instructions so that you see what your measurements are and how pieces are going together, but you'll have the video so that you can go in reverse anytime that you need to re-see something, how it's done, and I would match that up with your directions. So the next time that you go to make one, you can just quickly refer to your directions, or you can go back to the video, whichever works better for you. So the first part that we're doing, now that we've got our mesh all set up and ready to go, is we're going to make our 2 pockets. So I've taken my batting and I've set my batting on the wrong side of my pocket, and I clipped across the top with clips. You can use pins, whichever you prefer, whichever works best for you. And so now I have that all lined up. And I'm going to take my trim, or you could use piping. If you want to pick up some cute piping to go on here, you can do that as well. So now we're going to take our trim and we're going to place it raw edge to raw edge at the very top of our piece, and just clip it in place. And I'm just going to move it along my piece and clip it on there, matching up to my fabric. Now, if you have a directional fabric, make sure that you have your upside and your downside all set. But you'll be putting trim on the top and you'll be putting trim on the bottom. So now that I've got the top all clipped in place, I'm just going to turn it over. And I'm going to clip my other trim piece to the bottom side. And make sure that your batting stays in place as you're clipping this across so it matches up. So that way when we sew, we'll be sewing through all 3 pieces. Okay, so this is how it will look when you have it all clipped. So you go ahead and you'll do that with both of your pockets. We just have our batting on the back side of the front side of our pocket. We've clipped or pinned our trim to both the top and the bottom. I'm using Aurifil 100% cotton thread. And I'm using 40 weight. And the reason why I'm using a 40 weight thread is so it will be a lot more sturdy when I sew my pieces together, and it will stay a more sound construction for you. Now, since my project has white in it, I'm just going to use a white thread, but if you have a colored project, I do recommend, for this part of the sewing, it doesn't matter because we're not going to see these stitches, so you could just use a white. But when you get to your top stitching, you'll want a matching color. So what we're going to do is our first stitching is basically just tacking everything together. So we're going to use a longer length stitch of 4.0. And our normal, we're going to be doing 1/4 inch seams. However, my first stitching, I'm going to do just a couple threads over. So if you're using a 1/4 inch guide foot like I am, and you have your needle set in the 1/4 inch setting so it's lined up with your needle, I'm going to move it to the right 2 spaces, 2 thread spaces. If you're using a regular foot and you're using the 1/4 inch as your guide, I recommend just use a piece of tape and just move your, just put a tape down, but instead of being on your 1/4 inch, just come in just a little bit more than 1/4 inch. Because this is sort of like a basting stitch that we're doing. We're just basting these 2 pieces in place so that when we go to do our final stitching, we'll be doing a 1/4 inch seam. But this just makes it so that our basting stitch won't show when we do our actual stitching and flip everything around. I hope that made it understandable. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to sew along this side, and then you're going to turn it, and you're going to sew along this side, and you're going to go ahead and do both pockets. And I'm going to have my needle in the needle down position, so if I stop, my piece won't move out of position on me. Now, if you are using a piping, you could use your zipper foot to do the stitching because your piping might not be as wide. I used their direction for trim and made my own trim, so I was fine using my 1/4 inch guide foot. But if you're using not as wide of a piping, you could use your zipper foot and that would work just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do my other side. And as you'll see, I did my wider stitch just so I can tack it down. And you can go ahead and do your other pocket just the same way as the first one. Okay, so now that we have both sides done, or both pockets done with our trim, I'm going to take a clip, or you can take a pin, and I'm just going to clip it at the end of this piece, so at the top, separate from my batting, just so that I'll remember which is my top piece, because after I've sewn these together and flipped them out, my trim is going to turn easier towards my top than it will if I try to turn it the other way to the back. So that just makes it easier. Remember, when you're putting your pieces to the backing of your pocket, we're not going to put it on the batting side. We're going to be putting it on the top side of this. And if you're using a directional fabric, just make sure that both of them are in the up position when you're laying your, what will be your back piece afterward. We're actually sewing it to the top, and we'll flip it out afterward. So just go ahead and pin or clip that so that your raw edges match up. And we're going to do that along the top side and the bottom. So now that we have that all clipped or pinned, whichever you've chosen, we're going to do a 1/4 of an inch stitch. So I know that you've moved your needle, you know, so that you were getting a shorter stitch. So you just want to make sure that now you're going to be in the exact 1/4 inch. Now, prior, I probably accidentally told you to go that way. Your shorter stitch should have been over this side a little bit more. Oh, wait a minute. No, it was correct the first time. Skip that. Yeah, you would have done it right there a little bit before the 1/4 of an inch. I'm looking at things a little backwards now and thinking to my guide foot to the actual plate. The way that I told you the first time was the correct way. Don't listen to me at the moment. So now we're going to do an exact 1/4 of an inch. And we're going to be doing a regular 2.5 stitch. The first stitch we did longer just as a basting stitch. And we're going to stitch down each side, this side, and then we'll flip it and we'll do the other side. And I'm just making sure that my raw edges stay together, that this piece doesn't slip this way. If it starts to slip that way, just lift it up, slide it back over so that you stay with your raw edges together. And then we'll go ahead and we'll do our other side. So now we're just going to go between your two fabrics, slip your hand through, and just pull it through gently. And I'm just going to get my pieces lined up. So I'm holding on to my trim, and I'll finger press. And I'll do that on both sides. Just makes it a little easier when you go to press it. So first I'm just going to press the back side. And you can tell the back side because remember we put our clip on the fabric that was our front. And I'm just going to press this so it lays all nice and flat. And it will just make it that much easier when we're on the front side. We're going to take our trim and fold it down and press it. We'll do that with both the top and the bottom. So we're not going to worry about the bottom for the moment, but we are going to edge stitch the top so that your trim will stay down nice and flat. So for me, I'm using my left edge top stitch foot. The back side has one side a little higher than the other side, so that as my fabric is going up against it, it will keep my foot in line and keep it straight. However, you can use a regular foot and just guide it up, you know. Let me see. So if, darn, wrong foot. So if you're doing it with a regular foot, you'll just put your foot up against your fabric so that this inside of your foot on this side, on the left side, stays up against your fabric, and just do a stitch, keeping it straight up against the edge of the inside of that foot. And that will give you your straight edge. And this is when you'll, if you've been using white and you're using a certain color and you want to match that color, this is when you'll want to switch to that color. The back side doesn't matter quite as much, but if it's important to you, you can also put the same color into your bobbin. And we're only going to do the top trim because the bottom trim is going to get sewn when it gets sewn to the mesh itself. And that gives me a pretty nice straight edge for that. And I'm going to go ahead and do my other pocket. I've already prepared my other pocket. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that one while I'm right here. Whoop. I didn't get my fabric under there enough, so it bunched up a little bit. Okay, so now we have both of our trims on the top of our pockets all sewn down. And I'm going to trim my threads on the ends just to get those out of my way. Okay, so now we're back over with our mesh. And in the instructions, it tells you your measurement from your top down and from your bottom up. And it tells you to take a marker and mark a straight line across your mesh. Now you can do that if you prefer. I didn't like that idea for me personally. I don't want to get marker on my cutting mat. I could put paper underneath it and that would be fine. I could draw my line, but I really didn't want to have a marker line on my mesh. Just me. So what I'm doing is I put my first pins in on the measurement that they told me, and then I'm following, since there's holes in the mesh, I'm following those holes straight over, and then I put my next pin in. And I'm doing that along well, if I get the right pin. I'm following that along the bottom of my mesh. And so I'll end up with a line of pins rather than a line of marker. Now you can go ahead and you can do the marker if it's easier for you to do. I just felt like, well, this would work better for me. So this is how I'm going to do mine. And then it wants you to fold this up and check and make sure that it matches up. Well, if you've already drawn your line and then you find that it doesn't match up, you've already drawn your line and then it's going to be a pain. So I felt like doing this and just following my line across my mesh with my pins will work just as well for me. And I'm going to take my last 2 pins and you could put a piece of paper or a ruler up here so that you can follow your line a little bit easier. So now that I have my pins in, I'm going to put one more in here. Let me check this. I might have my last pin off. Let me check, make sure it's on the line. It is. So now if I fold this up and fold my mesh in half, I can see that my pins match up. And that's what I want. I want my pins to match up. So I took and I put my 2 pieces together at this end and I folded it in half and my 2 pins land right on top of each other. I hope that you can see that well. My lighting on this side of the room is not all that great. And I'm going to fold the other side in half and check my pins over here to make sure that they match up. And they do. So that's what's important, is that your measurement is matching up. And you can also double check with your ruler to make sure that between your pins that you consistently have your measurement that they've told you in your instructions. And I do. So I'm feeling pretty confident that when I sew my pieces down, they're going to line up the way that they're supposed to. So now we're going to take our 2 pockets. This is the upside over for this side, and this will be the upside for this side. So our trim that we sewed, our sewed side will go up here, and our sewed side will go up here, and the bottoms are in the middle. So this is the part we're going to sew, and this is the part that we're going to sew. So both the bottoms need to be going towards the center. And we're going to line the bottom up with our pins, and we're going to pin them in place. And you want to make sure that your pin goes through your pieces and then through your mesh. And just get them lined up against your pins so that this stays straight. And you're probably going to have to lift it up to get your pin up underneath there so that you can get it pinned into the mesh and into your fabric both. And just keep going across. Making sure that it gets lined up and making sure that your pin gets into your mesh and your fabric both. There we go. Almost to the end. Okay, so I have that side down. I'm going to do this side. And I'm going to put just a couple pins up in the top corners just to hold the tops of these in place, so they're not shifting on me when I go to sew them. And then I'm going to flip it around and I'm going to do the same on the other side. Remember, your trim that you didn't sew is going towards the inside. Does take a couple minutes to get them all pinned and lined up. Trying not to bend my pins too much. And then I'm going to pin these two corners just to make sure that they stay in place where I need them to be. And then once again, I'm going to fold my piece in half on both of the corners of the top. I'm going to fold them in half, hold them in place so that they're matching up real well. And then let me get this up here where you can see it better. Okay, so I have my tops lined up. And if you need to, you can put something heavy on each corner to hold it in place. And just fold this down and check and make sure that your pieces are matching up. Now, when you were cutting your fabric, and I should have mentioned this earlier, when you were cutting your fabric, they gave you a choice between widths. They told you one width or the other width. So, you know, between those two. And it just depends, you're cutting these pieces, the width of them, how much mesh you want to show. And since it's a mesh bag, I wanted mesh to show through. So I didn't cut I cut my pieces to the shorter width that they gave you. If you wanted less of the mesh to show, then you could cut them to the wider It just depended on which one you wanted. So I went with the smaller cut size. And then we did have to adjust our length to match up to our mesh, as I had described in the beginning. So now that those two are lined up, we're going to take this back to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch it. But I'm going to take out those place marker pins ahead of time so they don't get in the way. Not the ones that I did my pocket with, just the place marker ones. I'm going to get those out of my way so I don't hit them with my sewing machine or have them poking me. Now that I know that it all matches up and it's the right distance, I don't need those because I have everything all pinned down. I have my corners pinned down here on the tops of my pockets so they're not going to move. If you were using directional fabric, remember, you have to make sure, well, you won't have a problem with that because the sewed trim is going towards the top of this side and towards the top of that side. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the machine and we'll get this sewed. Okay, so now we're back at our machine and we're going to be sewing the bottoms of our pockets in place. And I'm going to do 2 seams just to be absolutely sure that this is nice and secured, so when things get put into the pockets, that it doesn't end up putting too much wear and tear on those on the seam down bottom. Now you can do 1 seam if you prefer. I'm going to do 2 just because I feel like it's going to make it a little extra secure and hold up a little bit longer over time. Once again, I'm using my left edge top stitch foot. I'm going to do this edge and then I'm going to move and I'm going to change, and I'll show you that when I get to it. Now luckily the mesh doesn't really stick to the bottom of my machine. It sews pretty well. Okay, so I have my first stitch down. My first seam. And so now I'm going to sew another seam. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this going the other direction so that I can sew doing the same thing and put a seam close to the bottom. And we're just using a regular stitch for this. It's going to be a little thick at the end, so just take your time, let it get started. Okay, so now I've got both my seams done. I went just a little bit off here. But for the most part, it's pretty straight going across. So we'll go ahead and we'll do the other side. Oops, I had it turned the right way the first time. And you might have to roll it up inside the throat of your machine to make room. I'm sorry, I know my hands are probably right in the way when we're sewing, but in order for me to hold on to this and keep everything in place, I've got to use both my hands. And you don't need to worry if your fabric or your batting extends past the edge of your bag, because we'll end up trimming that after. That's perfectly fine. Okay, we'll we'll sew this last side down. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trim my threads just to get those out of the way. I'm going to leave those pins up in the corner for now. Now, I'm going to put my 1/4 inch guide foot back in. And we're going to flip our mats over, your mesh screen over. I got to push a couple of things out of the way there. And so now we're going to baste our side seams in place. And I'm just going to do probably a 4.0 stitch just because we're basting. And just hold on to the bottom and roll it up a little bit so it doesn't catch on the edge of your table, whatever you're using to sew on. Mine, I know it would end up catching and cause a problem when I go to sew. And we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam. This is just a basting seam that we're going to go down each side. And I'm just going to baste it. This part overhangs a little bit. I'm just going to baste it up against the screen, or mesh rather. I'm not going to worry about the fabric that's overlaid. My guide foot can go on top of that. I'm just going to stay up against my mesh because I'm going to be trimming that off. And you can see that mine overhangs a little bit, and that's fine. I just use the edge of the mesh as my guide and put in my stitches. And then I'm going to turn it, and I'm going to do the other side the same exact way. And just remember, just use your mesh as your guide, not your fabric, because for me, my fabric is extending over on a couple of the sides. So go ahead and take that over to your cutting table and just put your ruler so it's up against the edge of the mesh and trim off whatever excess there is on each side. Okay, so for this next part, we're going to be putting our strip up along the edge. So do your measurement from the very top down to what they told you in the instructions. And the same thing, they told you to mark it with a marker. I'm just going to follow my pins along, following that line. Once I found my measurement, I'm just going to keep my pins going across that line in my mesh. So I have a guideline for my fabric. Now you can go ahead and you can draw the line if that's what you prefer to do, if that makes it easier for you. I just don't want to mark on my mesh. And whichever way is better for you, that's fine. I find it just as easy to go ahead and put my pins in the mesh. The holes are big enough that I can just put my pins in and keep them going across the mesh in the same line all the way across. That way I don't have to worry about the fabric covering up my marker line or making a mess with my marker. And maybe this takes just a couple minutes longer, but this is what worked for me. Okay, so now I've got my guideline going all the way across with my pins, all across the top. I'm hoping that you're being able to see that properly. Maybe if I put a piece of paper behind it, then you can see that I have my pins going all the way across to mark my line. Keeps wanting to slide off my table. So now you take your pieces, cut them the measurement that they told you. tool over here. So I used the Clover hot hammer, and I just went along, and you're going to do your 1/2 inch, fold over, and press. So I just like the hot hammer because I don't know what material it is, felt or something. So you just fold it over, and you can just press along and keep moving your hot hammer along, and just fold it over and press and fold it over and press all the way along to the edge. Got to remember to put that away after so my kitty doesn't play with it. So go ahead and press your seam, and on the front side we're going to take it and we're going to have this face down. Oh, wrong side, sorry. This side's going to fold over to the back side. So you don't want to sew this side down. Excuse me. So I've already done this one so that I can show you a little bit better. This is the side that I already pre-folded, and this is the inside of my tote. That is going to go over afterward. So we're going to take the raw edge that we didn't iron, and we're going to place that up against your line or your pins, whichever you chose to do. And we're going to pin that in place. And I'm leaving my pins that are already in there in, and I'm just going to go along, and I'm going to, oh, my magnetic glue is sticking to everything, of course. I'm trying to grab it as it goes. It's definitely strong magnetic. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this pinned, and I'm just going to press this raw edge up against where I pinned, or if you used a marker line, that's fine. And you may want to take and mark 1/4 inch. If you don't have a 1/4 inch guide foot, just go ahead and take a ruler and measure 1/4 inch from your edge, and make a, you know, a water soluble mark or a chalk mark, whatever works for you. And it will make a line so that you know that you can just follow that line to sew on. Whoop. It is slippery. And if your pin isn't poking through, then you know that you just didn't hit a hole in your mesh. Just move it over a little bit and you'll find a hole to poke it through. And I'm not worried about if my pins are pinning it in straight or not, as long as my edge is straight. I've got 2 different kinds of pins in my bowl. One of them fits the mesh, one of them doesn't. There we go. Trying to figure out where I put my foot. So I'm going to sew 1/4 inch from the edge of this all the way through. And like I said, if you don't have the 1/4 inch guide foot, don't worry about it. Just take a ruler and make a mark 1/4 inch down from your raw edge. Remember, your folded edge is over here. We're not sewing on that. We're sewing on the raw edge. And I left my pins in that I had as a marker, and I'll just take those out as I go along. So then I'm just going to finger press this up. Along my seam. And then I'm going to switch over to my left edge top stitch foot. And like I had told you before, you can use your regular foot and just follow along the edge of the inside of your foot on the left side. It'll work just fine. And we're going to top stitch. We're just going to do an edge stitch across this bottom. Now, because I didn't read my instructions properly the first time, I ended up doing 2 lines. So I'm going to do 2 lines on this side just because I did on the other side. You don't need to. It's just that I didn't read them correctly and thought I needed to. So I'm going to follow along so they look the same on both sides. And you can do this if you prefer. It'll just reinforce it. And I'll go ahead and trim those extra threads. Get those out of my way. So now we're going to fold this over. And we're going to, the folded part that we pressed, we folded it and pressed it. We're going to line that up with the very bottom of the fabric on the front side, on the outside. And I'm going to take my pin and I'm going to push it from the front side to the inside and sort of pin it backwards. So I'll be pinning, the pin will actually be on this side for me so that as I'm stitching, I don't have to worry about taking my pins out. And I think I did that stitch. Oh, I did. That's how I ended up with my second stitch. That's okay. I'll show you what I did in a minute. So the second row of stitching ended up being when I stitched this side down. That's how I ended up with 2 rows of stitching. I'm starting to get tired. Okay, so skip that second row of stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin this, just making sure from this side that it matches up to the bottom of the outside. And I'm putting my pins on the other side because that's the side we're going to be sewing from. So I'm going to follow, so what I had done before was I had followed this first line of stitching, knowing that that back side is folded a 1/2 inch. So my next stitching is just a little above by following this line here. It's just a little space apart. Whoop. So if you're doing that with your, whoops, that's not going to line up. I moved my fabric. I moved my fabric. And you can see from this side if it lines up and matches properly before you start sewing. So since I already sewed that second set by lining up my stitching with that edge of my foot, I can just follow along that stitching. Now, if you don't have the left edge stitch foot and you did your edge stitching, you could just go 1/8 of an inch up from your previous stitching when you did your top stitching. So basically my second set of stitching is just approximately 1/8 of an inch up from the other. When you take your last pin out, just make sure that they line up before you continue stitching. So now we're going to finger press all across the top. And we're going to edge stitch that. So we're going to edge stitch up here, or you could do 1/4 of an inch. You could do it the other way. If you have the 1/4 inch guide foot, you could go in this direction, and you could do 1/4 of an inch. I'm just going to use my guide foot and go across the top. Hits the edge of my table on the other side. So there we go. We've got that all done. Just trim your threads. And our next step will be getting our handles lined up. When you get back to your cutting table, we'll make sure that these edges are flush the way that they're supposed to be, like we did with the pockets. But before we go over, cut your handles to the full length that they told you to cut it. We're not going to cut them in half because we're going to keep our straps all one piece. So you're going to fold your strap in half, making sure that it doesn't twist all the way to the end. And then you're going to come back and you're going to do a 1/4 of an inch seam across the bottom. Now I did 2 stitches. One of them wavered a little bit, but I did 2 just to make sure that it was nice and in place. But you really don't have to, because when this gets sewn down, we're going to be doing a double seam across all of it. So there'll be a stitching on this side and a stitching on that side, which will nicely secure it to your bag. So we'll bring that with us, because we're going to line that up over at the cutting table where we have a little more room. So let's go ahead and we'll move over there. Okay, so now we're back at the cutting table. You're going to take your handle. We've sewed the 1/4 of an inch at the bottom. We're going to fold this so it's evenly in half. And you want your seam to be in the middle, in the center. And so then you'll have the center, you'll know the center of the other side. And the way to do that is just to easily take this and fold it in half, this, you know, fold it in half, then fold it in half this way, and make sure that your seam that you sewed is at the very bottom, and then you know where to put your pin for the other side. So now I'm going to lay this out. One side will get flipped over because you don't want your handle to be twisted. So it was like this when we folded it. We took that side. You want your seam side of your handle to be down. So we flip the other side up, and we're just going to take this and untwist it so that you'll have your half a, let me see, I'll do it at this end where you can see it. So it's going to kind of go like this, and it's going to lay flat on both sides without your handle being twisted in any way. It'll be kind of a half circle down here, but it won't be twisted. You're going to take your piece, your mesh bag, fold it in half, and you'll find the center on each side. Now, because we shortened the width of our bag, we're going to also shorten it by that amount between the two sides. So they give you a measurement for how far to go in. I'm going to take 1.5 inches off of that measurement. So I'm only going to put this in 4.5 inches. And you're going to line your pins up so that you're centered at the 4.5 inches from the edge. Now I'm giving you that measurement because the bag was set at a different size and we had to change it for the colored mesh. And so I'm just going to run my finger across, make sure that I have this centered, and I'm going to go ahead and pin this to the bottom of my bag. Okay, so now I have this side centered. I'm going to take this pin out so I can use it to pin it down on this side to make sure that I'm keeping this straight. And you're going to keep measuring as you go. so that your handle stays at the right distance all the way from the edge all the way up the bag. And you're going to do that on each side. So that you're keeping your handle nice and straight. And I'll keep checking it as I go. And take note on your instructions, because it tells you how far from the top you're going to sew. And that's where you're going to put your last pin in. And we will follow that instruction because the length of our mesh is the same as theirs. It's only the width that we changed. So I'm going to put my last pin in right at that measurement, making sure that I'm that 4.5 inches from my edge. And I'm going to pin the top of this at the very top, even though I know I'm not going to sew up there, because that will help keep my handle out of my way when I'm sewing. I don't want this side to flop down and get sewed. And so I'm going to do this end the same way, checking my measurement as I go and pinning. And this I just pinned into the pocket. I didn't worry about going into the mesh. Because that will keep it in line for me. And the same thing on this side. When you get close to the end, you're going to check that measurement that they gave you in the instructions and do your last pin. Right there. And I'm going to check and make sure that I have that straight, because it looks like I might be going... Okay, it is straight. I wanted to make sure. And then same thing down here. I'll put one... Ow. Not poking yourself, mind you. I'll put one last pin there. I know I'm only going to sew to this pin. And I'll show you in a minute. I'm going to make a little box here. And I'll probably do my box right from the bottom edge of that. So I'll be doing like a cross right in here to secure it. And the same at the other end. So I'm going to spin this around because it will be easier for me to work on this side. So once again, I'm going to line my center pin up with my center pin on this edge. And checking, you got to check as you go along to make sure that you have it the right distance from the edge. When you get to the other side, remember you want to put your pin in at that last point. And that's going to be really the bottom of our box. And then the top of our box will be right underneath that strip on the top. Because you need that box to secure your handle so it stays nice and solid on there and doesn't come off. Almost lost my ruler. I got that one a little bit off, so I'm going to fix that so I can keep my handle straight. I'll find my measurement from the top so I know where my box is going to stop. And I'll do my last pin up at the top. And then I'm just going to double check my measurement on my sides to make sure that I'm keeping this straight. And I'll check it on both sides just to be sure. Okay, I think we're good. So now we're going to go back to the sewing machine and I'll show you how we're going to sew this down. Okay, excuse me. So we're back at the sewing machine. I'm going to start at the top of one side and 1/4 of an inch approximately in. I'm going to sew a straight line across. I'm going to come down 1/4 of an inch to where my pin is, which is my mark for where I needed to stop sewing. And I'm going to sew straight across. Well, I'm going to do an X in here as well at the same time. So let me see if I can try to show that to you. I went ahead and moved the camera over to this side because I think my hands will be in the way on the other side, so you wouldn't be able to see. Oops. So I'm going to try to get my needle down right about where I think 1/4 of an inch is in from the outside. If I'm off a little bit, it won't matter. And I'm going to sew a straight line right underneath that strip. Now you could go ahead and you could mark out a box if you want. And I'll show you how you can do that as soon as I find my ruler. So you could just take your ruler and make a mark here, staying 1/4 of an inch from each side. And you could mark out a box down to that pin. Once again, you're going to stay 1/4 of an inch from the side, because that's going to be your seam. And just, you could just mark out a little box here. And that box is going to have an X in it. And that X is a reinforcement for your bag handle. So once I have my straight line across that, right underneath my strip, I'm going to turn this, and I'm just going to sew, and I'm going to use the inside edge of my foot as my guide. And I'm going to fold this up so I can get it to the end. Ooh, sticking myself with pins. And so I'm going to turn it, and I'm going to sew straight across here, and I'm going to start doing my box. Whoops. Not quite to 1/4 of an inch, so I'm going to go just one more stitch here. There we go. And I'm going to sew up the side at that 1/4 of an inch until I reach the top of my line. And then I'm going to turn this so I can sew a diagonal line down this way. And then I'm going to go back over my bottom line here that I had already previously sewed until I get over to this corner. And I'm going to twirl this again. I'm going to sew diagonally up this side, and that will make my X. And then I'm going to check. I'm not quite at 1/4 of an inch yet. I come out to the side just a little more. And I'm using the inside of my foot on this side as my guide for my 1/4 of an inch. Now, it might not be exactly 1/4 of an inch. That's fine. I'm pretty sure it's 1/4 of an inch, but it's close enough for my seam. And I'm going to sew all the way until I get to the other side where I need to make my box. And I'll take out pins as I go. And I forgot my magnetic pin thing. I use the cover of this to throw my pins into for now. And just slow down a little bit when you get to your pocket. It's going to get a little bit thicker through there. That's fine. pins keep catching me. And make sure that when you get to the other end that your handle's not stuck up underneath, because you don't want to end up sewing it. Okay, and that's my last pin right there. So I'm going to sew all the way up to the edge. I'm going to put my pin back there actually. Well, I'll make a little mark so I don't forget where I was with that pin. I'm going to sew up to the bottom of my strap. And turn this. And I'll sew straight across the bottom until I'm just about at 1/4 of an inch. I went just a little bit past it, I think. And once again, I'm going to work my way down to my mark. I'll turn and I'll sew straight across until I've made, I'm going to do this to make my box again. Now I know this is a little hard to see because I'm white on white with my thread. And I'm at where I've already sewn up my side, so I can go ahead and I can turn this and do my diagonal over to this corner. And I'll sew back down this side to the end where my mark is. And then I'm going to turn this so that I can do my diagonal up to this corner up here. So I'm going to be doing my second diagonal line up. Get it turned enough so I can do a diagonal. And then I'll sew back over to this side because I need to sew down the other side. One more stitch. There we go. And now we're going to just sew straight all the way till we get to where we did our box on the other side. And when I get to the very end, right under the strap, I'm going to reverse about 3/4 stitches, and then come back 3/4 stitches, and then I can cut my thread. So that whole side is all done. We're all set with that side. It's all secured. We've done our box, our reinforcement box on each side. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to do this other side the same exact way. So now you're going to go ahead and you're going to take your sides, starting at the top, match up your sides, line them up. Make sure that your two top edges are flush with each other. And then you're just going to line up your sides as you go, all the way to the bottom, down to the center. And we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam on each side. And I'm going to start at the top and work my way down to the bottom. So I'm going to take a few stitches and then I'm going to reverse so I can secure this. And when you come to where your two pockets are meeting up, it's going to get pretty thick right there, so just slow down and give your machine a chance to adjust a little bit to that thickness. And you're going to do the same when you come off of there. Just give your machine a couple seconds to adjust. And it's going from being pretty thick to not being thick at all with the mesh. And we'll do the same at the bottom. We'll go all the way to the end, and then we're going to reverse 3/4 stitches and come back. And then you're going to do the same exact thing on the other side. Just trimming a couple threads so I can get those out of my way. Okay, so now we'll flip it over and just make sure that your handles stay out of the way. And for this part, just, I probably didn't say it, but we had our right sides together. And same thing on this side. I'm going to sew a little bit, then I'll go in reverse, and then I'll continue stitching down through the side. And remember, when you get to those two pockets, you're going to need to slow down. And the same thing as we're going off the pockets. You just want to slow down and give your machine a little time to adjust. And we'll reverse at the end, and then come back and cut our stitch. Okay, so that's both of our sides done. You can go ahead and trim any stitches that you need to trim. So our last part that we need to do for these is to box. Oh no, we need to do our bias. I forgot. We're going to do our bias on the side, and then we'll box our sides and we'll be all done. Now for this last part, I already had some bias binding made up. I do have a tutorial on making bias binding. I don't see any reason why you can't use a regular 2.5 inch strip, except this is a little stretchier, so it will stretch around the corner a little bit easier. Other than that, I don't see any reason why you couldn't just use a plain 2.5 strip and then fold it in half. And you're going to take, and when you cut this, you're going to cut this from the top, measuring to the bottom, and leave yourself about 1/2 inch or so extra, because you're going to fold in on both ends about 1/4 inch. So I did 1/4 inch at the top, and when I get to the bottom, I'll fold in whatever is left over. So we'll start with that, and then you can clip this on, or you can just sew it as you go. It's up to you. I'm just going to go ahead and sew it. I'm not going to bother to clip it on. Just make sure that this is even with your top. And I've got my pieces folded in, so my cut edge is on the inside. Fold it in, and I'm just going to match this up with the very top. We're going to be going through quite a bit of thicknesses, so I've set my machine onto woven heavy to accommodate for going through the extra thicknesses that we're going to be sewing through now. And I'm just going to sew 1/4 inch all the way down, and when I get close to the bottom, I'll fold in the excess as I did with the top. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to take a few stitches and then reverse a few to reinforce this. Now when you get to the pockets, you're going to be going through a lot more thickness. So just slow down like we did before and give it time to adjust. And now I'm going to fold over my bottom. And I'm just going to fold it over until I can see, because this is a little bit stretchy, it stretched a little as it was sewing, which is fine. So I've got a little more at the end, and that's totally fine, just means it will be even more secure. And now that I have that folded over and tucked in, I'm going to sew all the way to the end, and then I'll reverse and come back to reinforce the end of it. And And then just trim your threads off. And then I'm going to fold this over. Now I've already gone ahead and done one side. So I just have this side left to do that I'm showing you right now. And when I sewed this side, I got this stuck up here by mistake. I'm going to fix this right now. Because I don't like it being folded up that way. Makes it look crappy. So go ahead and fix that. So now we're just going to fold it over nice and tight. And we're going to do 1/4 of an inch all the way down this side as well. And the same thing at the top. When I start out, I'm going to do a few stitches down, then I'll reverse and come back. That's just going to make sure that we reinforce it. And if you don't, like I said, if you don't know how to make the bias binding, I did a separate tutorial for bias binding. It is a little stretchier, which will make it easier for it to fold over. But you could use regular binding, just strips 2.5 inches wide, fold it in half. So we'll just keep folding this over. And my bias binding is 2.5 inches as well. Just fold it in half. And when we get to the end, we'll do the same thing. We'll come all the way down, we'll reverse and come back and reverse so we can strengthen the bottom. Okay. So go ahead and trim your threads again. This is going to be so cute. Stick this up under there for a minute. While I have it folded, I'm going to take a pin and stick it right in that bottom fold. A little more difficult to work with now, but just get that pin in there so that just so it marks the bottom for you. And we're going to box our corner. So you're just going to lay this down. I want to make sure that I've already boxed my corner on this side. And I have my binding is going in this direction, so I'm going to make sure that my binding on this side goes in the same direction. And so you're going to lay it down. Uh-oh. My pin fell out. All right, let me refold that and stick my pin back in. Okay. So once again, we're just going to fold this into sort of like a little triangle. And we're going to make sure that the seam up here matches with that center where the pin is. And we're going to line that up. And I also want to make sure that my pockets are matching up across right there. And you just adjust it until you get it in place, and just double check on the bottom that your seam is lined up with your pin. And you can kind of check it from the top as well. I'm going to manipulate this just a little more because I want to make sure that this is nice and straight. And check my seam, make sure it's above my pin. Okay, I think that looks good. And then I'm just going to take some clips. You could pin it, but I feel like the clips, if you have some, hold it a little easier for you. And then I'm going to take that pin out of the bottom so I make sure I don't sew over it. And then you're going to sew approximately about 1/8 of an inch right below where your pockets line up. Let me look at this real quick before I start sewing. I just want to make sure that that looks nice, and yeah, it does. Once it stands up, it looks more even. I'm just looking for it to look even on both sides, and I think it does. It's just the way that it's sitting kind of a little bit quirky on that side. There we go. I think I've got it now. And just make sure that your pockets line up going across. And we're going to sew approximately about 1/8 of an inch. I've got to lift this up. Get my arm out of the way. So I'm just watching that basically I'm watching that my needle goes about, I'd say 2 squares of mesh below my pocket. Will be approximately 1/8 of an inch. And when I start out, I'm going to sew just a little bit. I'm going to reverse and come back because we need to reinforce each side. And when you get to right in the center here, it's going to get pretty thick going across. So just give it some time to go across there. And I'm going to reverse and go back over this just to secure it a little bit more because I know that's going to be thicker right there. Now it's going to get really thick right in here because we have the binding, the double mesh. There's a lot going on, so just give your machine a little bit of time to go over that. And so I'm going to go through that, and I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to reverse, and I'm going to go through it again just to secure that down. And then once I get to the end, I'm going to reverse again and come back, and then I can cut my stitches. Now, usually when you do a boxed corner, they usually tell you to cut this part off, and that's not in the instructions. So I'm under the assumption, because we folded over our end down here, that they weren't planning on us cutting this. And I think that's why they're having us cut the corrugated cardboard to go on the inside, because these flaps will probably stay in place. So we'll turn it around so we have the outside going outside, and we'll take a look at it. It's definitely going to be a strong bag, which is nice. And those outside pockets will be really nice. Okay, I'm just going to push those corners out in the bottom. And as you can see, that boxed corner is just below your pocket. And we'll push out the other side. So as you can see, once again, on this side, our box corner is just below our pocket line. And I'm just shaping the bottom with my fingers, just going along the edge and sort of shaping the bottom. That's our box corner there. And I'm going to shape this side a little better. And on the inside, it's going to be hard to see from here, but I can see that they definitely didn't want you to cut that. And I know that's going to be really hard for me to show you in the camera, but those boxed corners just lay right down. They don't even stick up. And you'll see when you make yours that they lay right down. So don't cut that. If you're used to making bags, normally when you do a boxed corner, after you've done your sewing, you would cut it approximately about an inch, a quarter of an inch rather, from the stitching. And you're not going to do that with these box corners. You're going to leave those intact. Let me see if I can open this up enough so that you can see. You're going to leave those intact inside. I know it's really hard to see, but there's our boxed corner right here. You're just going to leave those intact, even if you didn't put a corrugated cardboard bottom in, or you could do a foam. You could do some of the, like in our Form Plus, and do a little sheet of fabric over that, or you could put a corrugated cardboard bottom in here. Even if you didn't, those corners lay right down flat. They don't even get in the way. They just lay flat perfectly. This is such a cute little bag. I really like it. And if you do decide that you want the corrugated cardboard in there or a foam piece down in the bottom, that will make it even nicer. Let me bring the camera over. I'd like you to be able to see the bag a little bit better. All finished. Let me see. Sorry about adjusting the camera so much. I just want to get you backed up so that you can see the finished bag. Whoops. But I think it's really cute. Now there's also an option that you can make a little thing to go over the handles. I never really care for them myself, but you can make a little cover that goes over your handles with some Velcro. I find they always get in the way on a bag. So I'm not going to make them for this one. I will find some corrugated cardboard. I think I have some upstairs in the closet that I'll cut a piece. The sleeve is really easy. Now, because we've adjusted our size, you will have to adjust what size you cut your corrugated cardboard for the bottom or your foam, whichever way you decide to go. You'll need to adjust that. Just measure on the inside across and the width, and you can cut it. And even if you need to trim it a little bit after you've cut it so that it fits. The sleeve is really easy. You'll cut double the length, and you cut your width, leaving enough so that you have a 1/4 of an inch seam going around 3 sides, and you'll just slide it into the sleeve and then fold the edges over, and you've got a little cover. Or you can just put the corrugated cardboard in there. Either way will work. Well, I hope that this tutorial has really helped you. I've had a lot of fun making the bag. I have another one all cut out and ready to go that I'm ready to make. And so if you have liked the video, please take a moment and like our video on YouTube and subscribe to Seaside Quilting Supplies. And right next to the subscribe button is a little bell, and if you click on that bell, you can switch your notifications to all, and as more tutorials come out, you'll be notified. So happy sewing. Have a good night.